Good morning. We are here today at the UNIKE conference in Copenhagen, University Futures. And we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Amsler from University of Lincoln. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. Her research focuses on politics of knowledge, education, political economy, and cultural practice. So, Sarah, on behalf of the UNIKE project, we would like to ask you a few questions related to the conference theme, University Futures. So, first of all, what do you consider to be the key trends in higher education today?
Thank you very much. I thought that I would try to focus the question a little bit because I work primarily in the United Kingdom and have worked in Central Asia and also a bit in the US and have a bit of a comparative perspective, but can speak only really to the things that I know. I thought I'd like to think a bit about historical processes and contending social forces as opposed to thinking about things in terms of trends, because I think that opens up quite a lot of space for thinking about what is at stake and what might the possibilities be of changing in particular ways. I think that in terms of the trends across universities, at least in the United Kingdom, one of the biggest sort of historical processes, which has been going on for a long time, more than 40 years, is the conversion of the public university system into something else. And I think most of the discussion around sort of crisis in higher education in that context and across Europe, any place where there has been something resembling a public university system or a public higher education system in what had been a social democratic or welfare state or a liberal democratic project. So I think that what is happening in this context is that for a variety of reasons and in a multifaceted ways, there's a real closing down of spaces for thinking about education in democratic ways and thinking about education that is in itself democratic, as well as a closing down of spaces for thinking about social democracy and more so even radical democracy. And I think that that takes a number of forms. There's a discursive closure, of course, about what it's possible to say about what education is and be taken seriously, to have something that is democratic and public or common as being intelligible within a market system. There's certainly an economic closure in terms of the construction of infrastructures, from sort of regional economies to multinational corporations, which have restructured the way that education is financed. Which does shift the balance of possibility in terms of how it's possible to fund certain kinds of learning and teaching and research. The structures of power in universities have changed quite considerably, but very slowly over a long period of decades, from something that was relatively autonomous, run as a professional organization, into something that is managed to varying extents from something that is quite cooperatively governed in some cases to increasingly a lot of authoritarian governance within institutions that people are feeling very powerfully. And modes of institutional and social change, I think, have changed as a result of that. So these things come together in quite different ways across institutions, even within institutions, across the disciplines, and certainly across different countries. But those are the things that I see, the forces I see contending. I think since about 2008, the last financial crash, a bit before then, but certainly sort of as part of the 21st century social movements, or even the post-2008 social movements, there has been an expansion of education struggles and movements which prioritize education, either public education or increasingly democratic autonomous education, in response to this sort of struggle around what higher education is, but also in response to struggles more widely. And a rearticulation or a rediscovery of radical education thinking in a way that hadn't been opened up for quite a while before that, because it was still focused. There was still quite a lot of space within certain institutions to think radically and to think critically about education. And I think as those spaces have closed down gradually over the decades, things have opened up quite a lot more outside. So there have been multiple trends in creation of spaces outside, and I think the emergence of some really interesting hybrid subjectivities, hybrid educator subjectivities, hybrid student subjectivities, where people are working inside and outside formal institutions, people are working across disciplines in ways, people are being quite disobedient to sort of academic norms that really no longer serve them, and that they no longer find useful for democratic movements.
Yeah, so you've pointed to some of the very important trends in higher education, and I know you've mentioned some of the challenges as well. Would you like to talk about what you think of these are the most significant challenges?
Sure. I think we can think about the challenges for the different people and groups and stakeholders that are involved. So, for market educational reformers, I think people and state bodies and corporate organisations that are really on the forefront of what is quite a really revolutionary change in what we understand higher education to be in these formerly social democratic and liberal democratic countries. I think they are quite emboldened and encouraged and facilitated by 40 years of the construction of an infrastructure for a market-led system. So much of the policy that's in place, if not all of it now, with loopholes, produces the possibility for creating market-led, market-oriented, market-disciplined and market-dominated forms of higher education, forms of educational subjectivities, forms of knowledge, forms of thought, and etc. However, these are also the very organizations and people who are in constant crisis, because the situation that they have created means that now they are struggling constantly for survival against each other in very, very inopportune and unfortuitous conditions, as markets are. And so the challenges, I think, for universities are framed in this way, in a dominant discourse. So both the struggle for survival is a challenge, which leads to all kinds of scheming around how to be more competitive, which is radically shifting the way that universities are working. So there's a lot of new things being created that people don't yet have the capacity. They're trying to keep up with the changes in the marketization of how to remain competitive. And at the same time, if you need to shed what is considered unproductive knowledge, unproductive people, inefficiencies, etc., the other thing that I think is a challenge is the resistance that is coming from most of the people working in the sector, who are feeling this very acutely in precarity, in abuse, in demoralization, in devaluation, in a sort of threat to democratic life and independent thought, and etc. So I think the challenges on that end are framed in two ways. One is the challenge of the market, and one is the challenge of anything that threatens your ability to survive in the market, which becomes often quite a very brutal combination. I think the challenges are slightly different. I think the democratic reformers, if we want to call them that, face similar challenges in terms of surviving, how to survive, how to have a livelihood, how to practice education in a market situation. But I think they face different challenges, so they're quite depressed. I think we are quite depressed by 40 years of this creation of this infrastructure, and there's quite a lot of attachment to traditional academic forms, which I think we presumed were effective levers of change, such as critique, such as dialogue, such as policy making, such as policy consulting, such as making changes from within institutions because people had positions of power within them to govern them as particular kinds of institutions. And those things are no longer effective for people. And so there's quite a lot of, one of the challenges is overcoming the sense of sort of overwhelming political depression about how this can be different. So I think, yes, there is a lot of resistance. But I think one of the challenges is really to find new ways of understanding what it means to be an academic. People are really making a lot of decisions about whether that is even an academic, an identity or a profession or a vocation that they can or want to hold on to. So there's quite a lot of movement, and I think one of the challenges is to sort of articulate within that the new sort of approaches to democratic education.
So among these struggles for survival in a marketized world, which we've talked a lot about in this conference, do you see any sources for hope, any possibilities for change?
I do. I mean, in terms of possibilities for change, I think if what you want is the construction of a market-led higher education system in the UK or anywhere else, then there's quite a lot of possibilities for change. There's quite a lot of things in one's favour. I think if what you want is something other than a market-led system, if what you want is something resembling traditional public higher education or common higher education, or something even more radical in terms of the expansion of knowledge production and higher learning and higher thought throughout society, then there are, I think, enormous possibilities. First of all, there is huge resistance to what is happening within the sector. Things are being brought to crisis in a way that they haven't been before. So I think one of the errors of judgment and analysis is there's quite a lot of discussion about this as the crisis, so that suddenly this has happened and it feels like a sudden event for quite a lot of people. It's been at least 40 years in the making, over a very long period of time. I think that the moment that we're in now is a moment of literal crisis, sort of the crisis meaning the moment at which things come to a point where you can go one way or the other through critical decision, maybe not entirely dependent on what you decide, but things are shifting. So some things are closing radically and some things are opening radically, and I think that is an incredible space of possibility that really needs to be sort of theorized and acted upon as such. I don't think that what we are seeing is an ideological consensus, even though it is presented as such. Certainly if all anyone ever reads is the mainstream higher education research journals, it's presented very much as a fait accompli, not least of all because there are multi-billion pound industries built up around this model of higher education. People have their careers based on it. You know, there are whole degree programs, there are whole institutions dedicated to the production of this new system, basically. However, I don't think it's an ideological consensus. I think it's an incredibly interesting hegemonic struggle in which there are very, very strong forces that are articulating other ways of thinking about what higher education is, not simply a defense of the public university, which I think is an important one in the places where that has existed. But there are really radical new imaginaries about what higher education could be that don't begin from any of the assumptions that we have been used to assuming.
And on that positive note, we would like to thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Sarah Amsler.
Thank you.